Step off the line, right now. That's what 76-year-old Walter Creed said to a man he had never met, on a firing lane he had no business walking toward, in the middle of a high-volume shooting event at Camp Atterbury Joint Maneuver Training Center in southern Indiana, with 300 people behind the line and a rifle in the stranger's hands that was 6 rounds away from turning into a pipe bomb. The stranger, a 32-year-old competitive shooter named Nathan Foley, looked at Walter the way you look at someone who has just walked into your kitchen and told you to stop cooking. Confused, annoyed, not afraid because he didn't know yet that he should be afraid. But within the next 4 minutes, Nathan Foley would be standing behind the firing line holding the 2 halves of what used to be his rifle barrel. And the old man who had told him to stop would be explaining to the rangemaster something that nobody else on that range had heard, because nobody else on that range knew how to listen. If that kind of story means something to you, type respect in the comments right now, and stay with me. Walter Creed drove a 2001 Toyota Tacoma with a camper shell on the bed and a magnetic ribbon on the tailgate that said USMC in faded red letters that had been bleached by 10 Indiana summers into something closer to pink, which Walter had noticed and decided not to replace because vanity was not a quality he had ever found useful. The truck had 214,000 miles on it. The odometer had stopped working at 198, and Walter knew the additional 16,000 because he tracked the mileage in a small spiral-bound notebook he kept in the glove box, the same way he had tracked everything for his entire adult life, by hand, in ink, with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years inside the United States Marine Corps, maintaining, inspecting, repairing, and certifying the serviceability of every weapon system, from the M9 service pistol to the M2 heavy machine gun. He lived alone in a ranch house on 4 acres outside Columbus, Indiana, a town of 48,000 people that was famous for its architecture and its engine manufacturing, and not at all famous for the retired Marine armourer who lived 12 miles south of the city limits, in a house with a detached workshop that contained more gauges, micrometers, headspace tools, and bore inspection equipment than some active-duty armories. The workshop was the centre of Walter's life. It was a steel building, 30 by 40 feet, with a poured concrete floor and a ventilation system he had installed himself, because the original builder hadn't understood that a man who works with solvents and lubricants needs airflow that moves in a specific direction, away from the workpiece, away from the operator's face, toward the exhaust, out. The bench was a 7-foot slab of butcher block maple, scarred and seasoned by 3 decades of oil and carbon, and the persistent smell of hops No. 9 bore cleaner. Walter's hands were the map of his career, thick, square-fingered, with calluses on the pads of the thumbs and the sides of the index fingers where they gripped pin punches, roll pins, barrel wrenches, and the knurled surfaces of torque indicators. There was a scar on the meat of his left palm, a half-moon divot from a receiver pin that had sheared under pressure in 1994 and sent a fragment through his glove and into the tissue between the thenar and hypothenar muscles, a wound that bled profusely, healed slowly, and left a mark that he could feel every time he wrapped his hand around a barrel, which was every day, because Walter Creed had never stopped touching barrels. Retired or not, Marine or civilian, 76 years old with a left hip that complained on cold mornings, and a right ear that had lost the top 2,000 hertz of its frequency range, from a career spent in close proximity to things that go bang. None of that mattered. What mattered was the steel. What mattered was the bore. What mattered was the thing he could hear in a rifle's voice that nobody else on Earth seemed to hear anymore. And that thing, that particular, irreplaceable, unteachable sensitivity to the sound a barrel makes when it is whole versus the sound it makes when it is not, was about to save a man's life on a firing line in Indiana, and nobody except Walter Creed would understand how. Camp Atterbury sits on 33,000 acres of southern Indiana terrain, rolling hardwood hills, creek bottoms, and flat training areas cleared for ranges and live fire exercises. The installation is a joint facility operated by the Indiana National Guard, used for military training, civilian law enforcement qualification, and, on designated weekends, organized shooting events open to competitive and recreational shooters under the Civilian Marksmanship Program. The event that Saturday was the Southern Indiana Precision Rifle Challenge, a 2-day competition that drew shooters from 6 states. The format was a timed course of fire, multiple stages, multiple distances, scored on accuracy and speed, with stages ranging from 50 metres to 600. The range complex occupied the southeast corner of the installation, 8 firing lanes, each with a covered firing position, concrete shooting benches, and electronically scored target systems. The lanes were separated by earthen berms, and the entire complex was backed by a 30-foot impact berm. The morning was overcast, 67 degrees at 0800, climbing towards 75 by midday, with a light crosswind out of the southwest that would affect the long-range stages but was irrelevant for the close work. 212 shooters had registered. Support staff, range safety officers, and spectators brought the total on-site population to just over 300. The sound was constant, the overlapping percussion of rifles firing on different cadences, from the sharp crack of 5.56 to the heavier thump of .308 to the concussive bark of the occasional .338, all of it layered over the ambient noise of a working range. Commands called over loudspeakers, brass tinkling on concrete, bolts cycling, magazine seating, and beneath it all the low, continuous murmur of 300 people, doing what people do when they're gathered around something loud and exciting and dangerous. It was inside this wall of sound, this dense, layered, seemingly impenetrable wall of noise, that Walter Creed heard a whisper. Not a literal whisper, something smaller, something that existed in the space between two sounds, in the gap between what a rifle is supposed to say and what this particular rifle had just said, and Walter heard it the way a mother hears her child's voice across a crowded room. Not because it was loud, but because his entire nervous system was calibrated to detect exactly that frequency of wrong. Walter was not competing. He hadn't competed in anything since a unit marksmanship match in 1997, and he hadn't particularly enjoyed that because competition required him to focus on his own shooting, which interested him far less than focusing on the weapons themselves. He was at Camp Atterbury because a friend, a retired gunnery sergeant named Phil Okafor, who ran the scoring section for CMP events in Indiana, had asked him to come out and help with the equipment inspection table, where competitors' rifles were checked for safety compliance before they were allowed on the line. Walter had spent the first 2 hours of the morning doing what he had done 10,000 times in uniform, running function checks, verifying bolt engagement, inspecting chamber dimensions, checking muzzle devices for secure attachment, and looking at bores. Looking at bores was the thing Walter did the way other people breathed. He would take a rifle, lock the bolt open, tilt the barrel toward the light and peer into the muzzle with one eye closed. And in 2 to 3 seconds he would see everything: the condition of the lands and grooves, the depth and consistency of the rifling, the presence or absence of copper fouling, and any irregularity that might indicate erosion, pitting, or a stress fracture. A stress fracture in a rifle barrel is a failure that begins at the molecular level. It starts as a micro-crack in the crystalline structure of the steel, caused by thermal cycling, the repeated heating and cooling that occurs every time a round is fired, the barrel expanding with the heat of combustion and contracting as it cools. Thousands of cycles, tens of thousands, each one flexing the metal at the grain boundary, each one widening the crack by a distance measured in angstroms, until the crack reaches a critical length and the barrel's ability to contain the pressure of a fired round is compromised. The failure, when it comes, is not gradual. It is catastrophic. The barrel ruptures along the fracture line, venting high-pressure gas and metal fragments laterally, directly into the shooter's face, hands, or body. Walter had seen it happen twice in his career. Once in 1989 at Camp Pendleton, when a Lance Corporal's M1602 barrel split during a qualification course and sent a shard of chrome-lined steel through the man's shooting glasses and into the orbit above his right eye. The Marine lived. The eye didn't. The second time was in 2003 at Camp Lejeune during a pre-deployment workup, when an M4 barrel that had been flagged for replacement but somehow cycled back into the arms room ruptured at the gas port and blew the handguard apart, breaking 3 bones in the shooter's support hand. Walter had been the armourer who inspected that barrel after the failure. He had held the 2 pieces in his hands and looked at the fracture surface under magnification and seen the beach marks, the concentric lines radiating outward from the origin point of the crack, each line representing 1 thermal cycle, 1 round fired, 1 step closer to failure, and he had counted them. 112 lines, 112 rounds between the crack reaching detection threshold and the barrel letting go. 112 chances for someone to hear what the barrel was trying to say. Nobody had heard it. Nobody had listened. Walter had decided, standing in that armory with 2 pieces of steel in his hands and the smell of burnt gas and blood in his memory, that he would never stop listening. By 10:30, Walter had cleared the equipment inspection table and was standing behind the firing line on the spectator berm, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the Stage 2 course of fire, a rapid engagement drill at 100 metres, 10 rounds, 30-second time limit. The shooters cycled through in pairs, and Walter watched them with the reflexive, unconscious evaluation of a man who has spent his life looking at the relationship between a human body and a weapon. He noted trigger discipline, muzzle awareness, reload technique, stance. He noted the rifles, the platforms, the optics, the barrel profiles, the muzzle devices, and he catalogued them the way a birdwatcher catalogues species, subconsciously, automatically, filing each observation into a taxonomy that existed nowhere except inside his own head. Lane 6. Nathan Foley. Walter noticed him because of the rifle. It was a custom-built AR-15 platform in .223 Wild, a precision barrel chambering that splits the difference between .223 Remington and 5.56 NATO, popular with competitive shooters for its accuracy potential. The barrel was a 20-inch stainless steel match profile, heavy, fluted, with a 1 in 8 twist rate that stabilized the 77-grain match ammunition Foley was running. The rifle was well built, clean lines, quality optic, a variable power scope in a precision mount. Foley himself was competent. His stance was solid. His trigger press was consistent. His transitions between targets were smooth and controlled. Walter watched him run the first string. 10 rounds, all inside the scoring zone, elapsed time 24 seconds. Good shooting, clean weapon, nothing wrong. Foley cleared his rifle, loaded a fresh magazine and set up for the second string. The range officer called the line hot. Foley pressed forward into his stance, acquired the first target and began firing. Round 1, clean report. The sharp, bright crack of a .223 pushing a 77-grain projectile through a 20-inch barrel at 2,900 feet per second. Walter's ears registered it, catalogued it, and filed it without conscious effort. Round 2, same. Round 3, same. Round 4, same. Round 5, same. Round 6. Walter's coffee cup stopped moving. It stopped halfway between the thermos and his mouth, suspended in the air by a hand that had suddenly forgotten it was holding anything, because every fibre of Walter Creed's attention had been seized by something that had just happened inside the barrel of the rifle on lane 6. The report, the sound of the 6th round, was different. Not louder, not quieter, different. The tonal quality had shifted. The fundamental frequency of the barrel's resonance, the note that a barrel produces when it vibrates in response to the pressure wave of a fired cartridge, had dropped. Fractionally, imperceptibly to anyone who hadn't spent 30 years with their ear 3 feet from a bore. But unmistakably, irreversibly, catastrophically different to Walter Creed. Yes, who heard the drop the way a concert violinist hears a string go flat mid-performance, not with the ear alone, but with the entire body. A full system recognition that something structural had changed inside the steel, and the change meant the steel was no longer whole. A good barrel sings, a cracked barrel screams, and round 6 had screamed. Walter set the coffee cup on the ground. He didn't set it down, he placed it deliberately because Walter Creed did not drop things and did not rush, and did not act on impulse, even when every neuron in his nervous system was firing a signal that said, "Move now." He stepped off the spectator berm and walked toward lane 6. His gait was controlled, unhurried, purposeful, the walk of a man who understands that running toward a firing line causes panic, and panic causes accidents, and accidents on a firing line cause the kind of outcomes that fill incident reports and ruin lives. A range safety officer, a young man named Coletti in an orange vest, saw him and moved to intercept. "Sir, spectators need to stay behind the—" "I'm a range inspector," Walter said. It wasn't true. He wasn't a range inspector. He was a retired marine armourer with a thermos of coffee and a spectator badge. But he said it with the flat, unquestionable authority of a man who has been in charge of things that matter for so long that the habit of command is indistinguishable from his speaking voice, and Coletti, who was 23 and had been a range safety officer for 4 months, stepped aside. Walter reached lane 6. Foley was settling back into his stance, preparing to fire round 7. Walter stepped to the edge of the shooting position, inside Foley's peripheral vision but outside the muzzle's arc, and said, in a voice loud enough to carry over the ambient noise but calm enough to avoid triggering a startle response in a man holding a loaded weapon, "Step off the line, right now." Foley looked at him. His finger was outside the trigger guard. Good discipline, Walter noted, but his face carried the confusion of a man whose concentration has been broken by an instruction that has no context. "What? Your rifle? Put it down. Step back from the line. Do it now." "Who are you?" "I'm the man who just heard your barrel crack. Put the weapon down." Foley stared at him. The range was still firing. Lanes 1 through 5 and 7 and 8 were active, the percussion of their reports filling the air with the dense, concussive rhythm of a working range. In that noise, in that chaos, an old man in a canvas jacket was telling him that he had heard something wrong with his rifle, from 2 lanes away, through electronic hearing protection, over the sound of 8 rifles firing simultaneously. It was, on its face, absurd. But something in Walter's eyes, the absolute, unwavering, unreasonable certainty of a man who knows what he knows and has never once been wrong about it, made Foley do something that surprised him even as he did it. He safed the weapon, he set it on the bench, and he stepped back. Walter picked up the rifle. He handled it the way he handled every weapon, with the particular, intimate care of a man who understands that a firearm is not a tool but a system, a contained environment of pressures and tolerances and metallurgical realities that exist in a state of controlled violence, and that the margin between controlled and uncontrolled is thinner than most people imagine. He locked the bolt to the rear. He tilted the barrel toward the overcast sky, letting the diffused light fill the bore from muzzle to chamber. He put his eye to the muzzle. He was still for 4 seconds, then 5, then 6. His breathing slowed. His focus narrowed to a point somewhere inside the steel, a point approximately 9 inches forward of the chamber, where the lands and grooves caught the light with a uniformity that was almost perfect, and would have been perfect except for a single line, a hairline, a filament, a fracture so fine it looked less like a crack and more like a thread of spider silk laid across the inner surface of the bore, that ran diagonally across 2 lands and into the groove between them, approximately 45 degrees off the bore axis, which meant it was a stress fracture propagating along the grain boundary of the barrel steel, which meant the barrel was failing, which meant the next magazine, 20 rounds of high-pressure gas expanding inside a tube that could no longer contain it, would have completed the fracture and opened the barrel like a flower. Walter lowered the rifle. He looked at Foley. "You've got a stress fracture," he said. "Approximately 9 inches forward of the chamber, running diagonal across 2 lands. The barrel is compromised. If you'd fired another 15 to 20 rounds, the fracture would have propagated to failure, and the barrel would have ruptured at the fracture line." He paused. "You would have lost your hand, maybe your face, depending on which way the fragments went." Foley's face went white. Not metaphorically. The blood actually left his face draining downward, leaving his skin the colour of the overcast sky, and his hands, which had been hanging at his sides, began to tremble with the delayed neurological recognition of a threat that was already past but that his body was only now beginning to process. "How?" he started. He stopped. He looked at the rifle on the bench. He looked at the muzzle, which looked the same as it had looked 5 minutes ago, which looked the same as it had looked when he cleaned it the night before, which showed nothing, revealed nothing. Ear betrayed nothing of the catastrophe coiled inside its steel. "How did you hear that?" The rangemaster arrived within 3 minutes. His name was Dale Prescott, a retired Army warrant officer who had been running CMP events at Camp Atterbury for 9 years. He was 58, compact, bald, with the economical movements of a man who has spent his professional life in environments where excess motion is waste, and waste gets people hurt. He had been alerted by Coletti, who had radioed the range tower with a message that consisted of 6 words. Lane 6, possible barrel failure, civilian. Prescott walked to lane 6 expecting to find a cracked stock, or a loose muzzle device, or one of the dozen minor equipment issues that occurred at every competition, and that required nothing more than a replacement part and a form. What he found was Walter Creed standing beside a bench-rested rifle, with a young man who looked like he had just been told the date of his own death, and a gathering of nearby competitors who had stopped shooting to watch. "What do we have?" Prescott asked. Walter told him. He used the same language he had used for 30 years in armory reports. Technical, precise, devoid of drama, the language of a man who describes damage the way a pathologist describes tissue, because the description must be accurate and accuracy requires detachment. Stress fracture, bore surface, approximately 9 inches forward of the chamber. Diagonal propagation across the rifling, 2 lands and 1 groove. The tonal shift in the report was consistent with a loss of bore integrity. The fundamental resonant frequency of the barrel dropped between round 5 and round 6, indicating a change in the structural stiffness of the barrel wall. I'm estimating the fracture has penetrated approximately 40 to 60% of the wall thickness, based on the degree of tonal shift. Another 15 to 20 rounds at full pressure loads would bring it to critical. Prescott looked at him. He looked at him the way people look at Walter when he talks about barrels, with the expression of someone who is hearing a foreign language spoken so fluently that they can sense its precision without understanding its vocabulary. "You heard a tonal shift," Prescott said, "from 2 lanes over." "Yes. Through hearing protection. I wear passive muffs. They attenuate evenly across the frequency spectrum. Electronic amplification cuts above a threshold and reintroduces distortion. Passive muffs preserve the tonal character of the report. I've worn them for 30 years for exactly this reason." Prescott looked at the rifle. "I've got a bore scope in the tower. Let me take a look." He picked up the rifle, carried it to the range tower, a raised platform at the center of the firing line, and mounted his bore scope, a fiber optic inspection tool with a camera and a monitor that displayed the interior surface of the barrel in high-definition magnification. He inserted the probe from the muzzle end and advanced it slowly, the image on the monitor showing the spiral pattern of the rifling as the probe travelled down the bore. At 9 inches from the chamber, he stopped. The fracture was visible on the monitor, a dark line crossing the bright surface of the steel, jagged at the edges where the crystalline structure of the metal had separated along the grain boundary, branching slightly at one end in the characteristic dendritic pattern of fatigue cracking. It looked like a river seen from space, thin, branching, following the path of least resistance through the terrain of the steel's microstructure. Prescott stared at the monitor. He zoomed in. The fracture filled the screen, its edges sharp and dark, the beach marks of thermal cycling visible as fine, concentric lines, radiating from the origin point like the growth rings of a tree. "My God," Prescott said. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way a man says it when the words are not an exclamation but an acknowledgement, the quiet, an involuntary recognition that something very bad had been very close, and was now, by the thinnest margin imaginable, very past. Prescott pulled the bore scope and set the rifle on the tower bench. He called a full-range ceasefire. All 8 lanes, all activity stopped. Within 30 seconds, every rifle on the line was grounded, every bolt locked open, and 212 competitors were standing behind their positions wondering what had happened. Prescott walked back to lane 6. A crowd had gathered, competitors, range safety officers, spectators who had drifted forward from the berm. Nathan Foley was sitting on the ground behind his shooting position, with his back against the lane divider, staring at nothing. The colour had not returned to his face. Walter was standing beside the bench, his hands in his jacket pockets, so his face carrying the calm expression of a man who has done what he needed to do and is waiting for the world to catch up. Prescott addressed the crowd. He kept it brief. A barrel defect had been identified on lane 6. The rifle was out of service. The ceasefire was precautionary. The range would resume operations in 10 minutes after a safety brief. He turned to Walter. "I need your name for the incident report." "Walter Creed." "And your qualification? You told Coletti you were a range inspector." Walter looked at him without apology. "I'm not a range inspector. I'm a retired Marine armourer, 30 years, MOS 2111, small arms repair technician. I spent the last 12 of those years as the chief armourer for Weapons Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, and before that I was the armourer school instructor at Marine Corps Engineer School. I've inspected, repaired or condemned approximately 14,000 barrels in my career." He paused. "I told your RSO I was an inspector because he was about to stop me from reaching that firing lane, and if he'd stopped me, the next round out of that barrel might have been the last thing that young man's right hand ever felt." Prescott looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the rifle on the tower bench. Then he looked at Foley, who was still sitting on the ground with the 1,000-yard stare of a man processing a reality that hasn't fully arrived yet. 14,000 barrels, Prescott said. "Yes. And you heard the fracture, from 2 lanes away, Over the noise of 8 rifles firing, I heard the tonal shift. The fracture is what caused the shift. I didn't hear the crack itself. Nobody can hear a crack that's inside the steel. What I heard was the change in the barrel's voice. Every barrel has a resonant frequency. It's determined by the barrel's length, diameter, wall thickness, and material composition. When the barrel is intact, the frequency is consistent shot to shot. When the barrel develops a fracture, the structural stiffness changes and the frequency drops. The drop is small, maybe 2 or 3 Hz on a fundamental that's in the 400 Hz range, but it's there, and once you know what it sounds like, you can't unhear it. He looked at Prescott. A good barrel sings, a cracked one screams, you just have to know the difference. The range resumed operations at 11:15 after Prescott's safety brief, which was the most attentive safety brief in the history of Camp Atterbury's CMP program. Not because Prescott said anything different than he usually said, but because the 212 shooters standing behind the line had just learned that a barrel had been 1 magazine away from catastrophic failure, and that the only reason it hadn't failed was an old man in a canvas jacket who had heard a sound nobody else could hear. Foley's rifle was impounded for metallurgical analysis. Prescott tagged it, sealed the action with evidence tape, and locked it in the range tower's equipment cage. The barrel would later be sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where a metallurgist would section it, examine the fracture surface under electron microscopy, and confirm what Walter had estimated by ear. The crack had penetrated 53% of the barrel wall thickness, with active propagation markers indicating the fracture was advancing with each round fired. The estimated rounds to failure was between 12 and 22. Foley had 20 rounds in the magazine he'd been about to fire. The report would note that the fracture originated at a subsurface inclusion, a microscopic impurity in the steel, introduced during manufacturing, invisible to any inspection short of ultrasonic testing, undetectable by visual bore inspection until it reached the surface, which it had done approximately 50 rounds before Walter heard it. Phil Okafor found Walter at the equipment inspection table after the range resumed. Phil was 63, built like the gunnery sergeant he'd been, wide through the shoulders, narrow through the hips, with the particular economy of motion that career Marines develop from decades of operating in spaces designed for people smaller than they are. He set 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat down across from Walter. "You're the talk of the range," Phil said. Walter said nothing. He was disassembling a competitor's bolt carrier group that had been flagged for excessive carbon buildup, his fingers moving through the task with the automatic, hypnotic fluency of a process performed so many times it had migrated from the conscious mind to the spinal cord. "How do you hear it, Walt?" Phil asked. "I've known you for 20 years and I still don't understand how you hear it." Walter set the bolt carrier on the table and looked at his hands. The calluses, the scar, the thick, blunt fingers that had touched 14,000 barrels and could feel a burr on a bore surface the way a blind man reads Braille. By touch so refined it registered variations measured in 10,000ths of an inch. "You remember Pendleton?" Walter said. 89? Phil nodded. He knew the story. Everyone who had served with Walter knew the story. The Lance Corporal, the A2, the barrel split, the shard through the glasses. "After Pendleton, I started listening," Walter said. "Not on purpose, not as a technique. I just started hearing it. The way a barrel sounds when it's whole. The way it sounds when it's not. It's like, you know how some people can hear a car engine and tell you which cylinder is misfiring? Same thing. The barrel is a tube. When a round goes through it, the tube vibrates. The vibration has a frequency. The frequency is determined by the physical properties of the tube. Change the properties, add a crack, reduce the wall thickness, alter the stiffness, and the frequency changes. The change is tiny, a few hertz. Less than the difference between 2 adjacent piano keys. But it's there." He picked up the bolt carrier and resumed disassembly, his fingers finding the retaining pin without looking. "After Pendleton, I spent 6 months in the armory test-firing barrels that had been condemned for various defects. Stress cracks, erosion, corrosion pitting, heat damage. I fired them, and I listened. I catalogued what each defect sounded like. A stress crack drops the fundamental. Erosion flattens the harmonic. Corrosion pitting adds a buzz, a roughness in the sustain like a guitar string with a dead spot. I built a library in my head. 30 years of listening, barrel after barrel, round after round, until the library was so complete that I didn't need to think about it anymore. The ear just knows. The way your tongue knows the difference between salt and sugar without consulting your brain. Phil looked at him. You're telling me you can hear the difference between a healthy barrel and a cracked barrel from the sound of a single round? Not from the sound of a single round, from the difference between two sounds. Round 5 and round 6. Round 5 was correct. Round 6 was not. The change is what I heard. If I'd only heard round 6 with no reference, I might have missed it. But I had the reference, 5 rounds of a barrel singing true and then 1 round of a barrel that wasn't. That gap, that drop, that's what grabbed me, he paused. It's not magic, Phil. It's pattern recognition. The same thing a doctor does when he listens to a heartbeat and hears an arrhythmia. The same thing a mechanic does when he hears a knock in an engine. The pattern changes, and if you know the pattern, you hear the change. He looked at the bolt carrier in his hands, the metal gleaming under the fluorescent light, the machined surfaces precise and clean. The only difference is, most people don't spend 30 years learning the pattern of a rifle barrel. I did. Not because I wanted to, because after Pendleton, I had to. Foley found Walter at 14:30, after the Stage 4 course of fire. Walter was sitting in a folding chair behind the equipment table, his thermos empty, his hands resting on his thighs, his face turned toward the firing line with the distant, focused expression of a man who is listening to 8 rifles fire simultaneously and hearing each one individually, the way a conductor hears each instrument in an orchestra. Foley walked up and stood in front of him. He looked different than he had that morning. The colour had returned to his face, but something behind it had changed. The confident, unhesitating assurance of a competitive shooter who trusts his equipment and his skill had been replaced by something more careful, more alert, more aware of the invisible line between a controlled explosion and an uncontrolled one. "Mr. Creed," Foley said. Walter looked at him. "Sit down." Foley sat. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been shooting competitively for 8 years. I've put maybe 30,000 rounds through various rifles. I've never had a barrel failure. I've never even thought about a barrel failure. I don't know what I thought. I thought barrels either worked or they didn't. I didn't know they could, that there was a space in between," Walter nodded. "Most people don't. Most people think a barrel is a pipe with rifling cut into it. They think it's either good or bad, like a light switch, on or off, but a barrel is a living thing, not literally. It's steel, it's metallurgy, it's crystalline structure and grain boundaries and thermal expansion coefficients. But it changes. Every round changes it. Every thermal cycle moves the metal, expands the bore, shifts the stress distribution. A new barrel is one thing. A barrel with 5,000 rounds through it is a different thing. A barrel with 10,000 rounds is a different thing again, and somewhere in that continuum, somewhere between new and done, there's a point where the barrel starts to fail. Not all at once, not visibly, not in a way that any gauge or scope or computer can catch until it's already happening. But if you're listening, if you know the language and the barrel tells you, it tells you in its voice, and today, your barrel told me. Foley looked at the firing line. The sound of rifles was constant, crack after crack after crack, the percussion of controlled detonations rolling across the range like industrial thunder. "It all sounds the same to me," he said. "It's not," Walter said. "Every barrel sounds different. Every round sounds different. The differences are small, smaller than you'd think possible, but they're there. Yeah, and once you hear them, you can't go back. You can't unhear them. Every rifle you ever fire, for the rest of your life you'll be listening. Not because you want to, because your ear will know what to listen for and it won't let you ignore it." He looked at Foley. "That's not a bad thing. That's what keeps you alive. Your eyes can lie to you. A bore that looks clean can be failing. An inspection that passes can miss the thing that matters. But the sound doesn't lie. The physics doesn't lie. The frequency is the frequency. And when it changes for a reason, and the reason is always the same. Something inside the steel is not what it was." Foley was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you for what you did today, for hearing what nobody else could hear, for walking onto that line and telling me to stop." Walter looked at him. "Don't thank me. Listen. That's the only thing I've ever asked anyone to do. Just listen." Prescott closed the range at 17:30. The last competitors packed their gear, loaded their trucks, and pulled out of the gravel lot, their tyres crunching on the limestone dust that covered everything at Camp Atterbury, like a fine, persistent snow. The range safety officers broke down the target systems, collected the brass and policed the firing line for debris. Prescott walked the line himself, a habit from his army days, the final walk-through that confirmed everything was clear, everything was safe, everything was accounted for. He found Walter at the equipment table, packing his inspection tools into a canvas roll, the same type of canvas roll he had used in the Marine Corps, the same layout of pockets and slots, each tool in its place, each pocket sized to the tool it held, the order unchanged in 30 years because the order worked, and Walter Creed did not fix things that worked. "Creed," Prescott said. Walter looked up. "I've been running ranges for 9 years, military and civilian. I've seen barrel failures, 3 of them. Everyone was caught by visual inspection or by bore scope. I've never, in 9 years, in thousands of shooters, in hundreds of thousands of rounds, I've never seen someone catch a barrel defect by ear." He paused. "I called the Aberdeen lab this afternoon. They confirmed your assessment over the phone based on the bore scope photos I sent. Stress fracture. Subsurface origin, approximately 50% wall penetration. They said the barrel was in the failure window. They said your estimate of 15 to 20 rounds to rupture was consistent with their preliminary analysis." He looked at Walter. "They also said they've never heard of anyone detecting a stress fracture by auditory signature alone. They said it shouldn't be possible at the distances and noise levels you described." Walter finished rolling his toolkit. He tied the canvas straps and set the roll on the table. "It's not about what should be possible," he said. "It's about what happens when you spend 30 years doing one thing. The body learns, the ear calibrates, the brain builds a model so detailed and so fast that it can detect a deviation before the conscious mind even registers that it's listening. It's not a gift. It's not talent. It's mileage. It's 14,000 barrels and every sound they ever made stacked up in my head like a library I can't close. All I did today was check out the right book." Prescott extended his hand. Walter took it. The handshake was brief, firm, 2 pumps, the handshake of 2 men who work with their hands and judge other men by theirs. "You saved that kid's hand today," Prescott said. "Maybe his life." Walter picked up his tool roll and his empty thermos. "I heard something," he said. "That's all. The barrel did the talking. I just understood what it said." Walter drove home in the Tacoma with the windows cracked and the radio off. He always drove with the radio off. The silence wasn't preference, it was practice. Even on the highway, Walter listened, to the engine, to the tires, to the suspension. Every sound a signal, every signal a story, every story a data point in the library of mechanical sound that his brain had been building since 1978, when a drill instructor at Paris Island put an M1601 in his hands, and he heard, for the first time, the note that a rifle makes when everything inside it is exactly right. He parked in his driveway. The ranch house was dark. He turned on the porch light, the same light Eleanor would have turned on if Eleanor had been there, but Eleanor had never been there because Walter Creed had never married, had never had the kind of life that made room for another person, because the workshop and the barrels and the listening had taken up all the space and he had never pretended otherwise. He walked to the workshop. He turned on the fluorescent lights. The maple bench glowed under the tubes. The smell of Hopper's No. 9 rising from the wood like a memory made physical. On the bench sat a barrel, not a rifle, just a barrel. A 20-inch stainless steel match-grade barrel, unfitted, unchambered, a raw tube of 416R stainless that he had bought 3 years ago and never installed in anything because he liked having it there. He liked picking it up. He liked holding it to the light and looking through it and seeing the perfect, unbroken spiral of the rifling, a geometry of precision cut into steel by a machine, but brought to meaning by the hands that held it and the ears that listened to it. He picked up the barrel. He held it the way he held all barrels, with both hands, one at the muzzle, one at the shank, the weight balanced across his palms. He tilted it toward the light, clean, whole, silent. A barrel that had never been fired, that had never sung, that had never screamed, that existed in a state of pure potential. Walter set the barrel down, he turned off the lights, he walked to the house, made his coffee, the drip machine, the same one he'd had for 15 years, and drank it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the Indiana dark, hearing nothing, hearing everything, hearing the silence the way only a man can hear it who has spent his whole life listening for the one sound that means something is about to go wrong. If this story reminded you that the most important skills aren't always the ones you can see, that some people carry knowledge so deep it lives in their bones, in their hands, in the frequency of a sound that nobody else can hear, then subscribe to this channel. And we tell these stories because the men and women who spent their lives learning to listen don't stop listening when they take off the uniform. They hear things the rest of us miss. They catch the thing that's about to go wrong before it goes wrong. And sometimes, on a Saturday morning at a shooting range in Indiana, what they hear is the only thing standing between a young man and a catastrophe that would have arrived in silence. Share this with someone who served. Comment if you've ever met someone whose instincts saved the day. Hit subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.